Good afternoon. My name is Ruthann Angle, and this is a belated celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday, which we always do in January. And today I thought I'd share some thoughts about Martin Luther King Jr. that perhaps you may not have heard before. All of us here know who he was and lived through his times. I did too, and somewhere along the way I began to pay attention to this man. I think our church in Peru talked about him some, probably because he used passive resistance. I'm sure not everyone liked him because they thought he just caused so many problems. But I noticed him and began to follow the news, apparently. I was born in 1946, so my growing up years were the 1950s. I started high school in 1960 and college in 1964. MLK had all of his education through his doctorate by the time he married Coretta in 1953. Coretta was a really accomplished musician, and MLK had preached some at his father's church in Atlanta, but his first pastorate was in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, even though I lived through these times, I have still read voraciously about the civil rights era, and I have 2 bookshelves to prove it. Of course, I'm still reading about those times and what's still happening now with African Americans in our country. We are a long way from slavery, but also nowhere close to true equality. However, I have a passion to learn as much as I can, and with civil rights, that all started with MLK. I also had the privilege of attending a superb civil rights trip to the South in 2017 with a Black friend of mine who was exactly my age and grew up in the same era, but of course she saw the times from an entirely different angle. She had attended college in Montgomery. Montgomery is the capital of Alabama, and what struck me as I saw those beautiful marble Capitol buildings was the stark contrast between those pure white government buildings and the terribly dark history of racism in that state. So Montgomery was where MLK was called to start his ministry. Apparently, his church, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, was a pretty well-to-do congregation with many business ties in the community. Their older retiring pastor had become pretty activistic later in his ministry there, and they were hoping that a new, young pastor would be more pliable and malleable so that they could steer him in their direction, which must have been to not rock the boat. Of course, we all know that they failed miserably in that goal. He did rock the boat, and this city is where the year-long bus boycott succeeded in integrating the transportation system. Of course, for MLK, that was just the beginning. Okay, so this boycott was in 1955, and I'm only 9 years old. I'm sure I didn't watch the news nearly as much as I do now, and I'm not even sure I knew about that boycott, or even what a boycott was. But then in 1959, MLK and Coretta visited India to study Mahatma Gandhi's life of passive resistance. And in 1960, MLK resigned from the Montgomery Church to run the Southern Leadership Christian Conference which he had founded with others in 1957. So now this is 1960. I'm a high school freshman, and I'm sure that I was more aware of what was going on because I learned that MLK was often criticized for staging marches and demonstrations when a lot of news media were present. Why did he do that? A professor on our civil rights trip explained that that was on purpose because he wanted the world to see what blacks were dealing with. I don't know about you, but I saw Bull Connor with his fire hoses and his dogs. And I saw the Birmingham church bombing and what happened to the 4 joyful little girls who had just left a Sunday school lesson entitled "A Love That Forgives." Seeing that church where in one window just the face of Jesus had been blown out was unnerving, to say the least. TV news back then was a precursor to our current cell phones and 24-hour news channels, which can capture events in real time. And real time is why the death of George Floyd has affected so many. We watched him die right before our eyes. The reason I know that in high school I had become more aware of civil rights struggles is because in my senior year English class, I wrote a senior thesis on passive resistance, including Gandhi and MLK. Before that, however, just before my senior year started, I clearly remember watching on TV all day the August 28, 1963 March on Washington and being mesmerized by it. It was a peaceful march of 250,000 people, so I'm sure it made it into my senior paper. I'm happy to say that I got to see the march because those were the days when we started school after Labor Day. So these were all events during my early years, and they made a major impression on me. But now we come to the mid-1960s when I'm in college, and I'm not the only one who paid attention to current events. The 60s became one of the most violent decades in U.S. history. The Vietnam War had us all riled up because it was my generation of men who were going over there and dying. I later read McNamara's book, where he finally admitted that it was a mistaken war, his term. But many of my friends and even residents here at Timbercrest were in that mistaken war. MLK began to speak out against the war and took a lot of heat for that. He famously said that true peace is not merely the absence of tension. And I've heard that term as struggles or war. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. And in Vietnam, as well as civil rights, there was an absence of justice. Of course, we all know that John Kennedy and his brother Bobby and MLK all died in the 60s. Even Malcolm X was killed, but his militancy truly scared me and my friends and family. Fortunately, I've read much more about him and have come to respect him too. Another important event in 1968 was MLK's visit to Manchester College. We were his last speech on a college campus before his death. He was not allowed to stay overnight at the Hellmans in North Manchester because opponents in town found an old law on the books that said that no Negro could stay in town overnight, a sundown law. I have since heard his speech again, but I simply could not remember what he said that day. It was his voice, his cadence, and his power that I do remember so clearly. It was a highlight for me. Sometimes I ponder whether the times make the man or woman, or whether the man makes the times, like MLK. So, do the times draw up the leadership needed for those times? Or does that leader come along and is able to meet some of the demands of that time? I'm not sure. And maybe it's both. While the civil rights struggles are still going on in our country, I'd have rather had MLK and Gandhi leading the struggles than a Hitler or a Mussolini. We still have a long journey for civil rights for all Americans, as many other countries do too. And the 60s were not a giant leap for MLK's beloved community. But they were a step. And I think he was right when he said that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. Someday, I trust that we will treat all people with more respect and decency, but not in these times, of course, and maybe not till after I die. But I believe that time is inevitable if we can maintain a civilized society. Therefore, throughout all my continuing reading and research, MLK clearly emerges as human and imperfect, but still, he was, he is, and always will be one of my heroes.